Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Spring4Force.com Developers. As you may know, Salesforce.com is a publicly traded company, and therefore we do need to share this safe harbor statement with you to let you know that any forward-looking statements are just that, forward-looking statements. If you have any more questions regarding this safe harbor statement, you can find it on our website under the Investor Relations section. With that, I'd like to introduce Quinton Wall.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Quinton Wall, Developer Evangelist for Salesforce. It's kind of early here in San Francisco, so the sun is still coming up. It should be a nice day, so we appreciate everybody joining us here. I'm also joined on the line by Josh Long, Developer Advocate from SpringSource. Good morning, Josh.
Good morning.
So Josh is here to help us talk about, obviously, Spring and SpringSource and how that relates to VMforce. So we'll be talking a lot about kind of the Spring details and how Force.com developers might be able to come up to speed and learn how and when they can take advantage of Spring, in particular, obviously, inside VMforce. Now, this session, we won't be talking too much details about VMforce itself, although there is another webinar coming up on September the 9th where we will be going into much more technical detail. But what we wanted to do on this first introductory webinar is really give you guys an understanding on some of the power of the Spring framework and how you as a Force.com developer can come up to speed and start to learn and take advantage of it quickly. So with that said, we've got a lot to go through. Josh has got some kind of great demos that we're going to go through. We're going to try and relate all of those back to Force.com technology, so you guys have a bit of an analogy to draw from common knowledge that you have. But as we kind of kick off, most of you, obviously, being Force.com developers, are very familiar with Force.com as the platform, the leading cloud platform that Gartner and very many other analysts have sort of put us in that market leader category. But really what we're talking about here is the right-hand side of what you're seeing now, which is that product innovation. You've all heard about Chatter for the social enterprise. AppExchange has over 1,000 AppExchange partners on there now, but specifically VMforce, which is really the crux of where we're talking around here, being the enterprise Java cloud and the way that Java developers can go and move to the cloud, and specifically how Spring framework developers and SpringSource developers can do that as well. So I mentioned I'm not going to talk too much specifically about VMforce itself, but it is important for everybody to have a bit of an understanding on what VMforce is and why it's important. Not just important for Java developers, but important for Force.com developers as well. So the big thing is, if you're looking at VMforce and you're, say, a Spring developer, you can now run your Java apps on the cloud inside Force.com. Obviously, what that means is you can build new Java apps in the cloud very quickly and very rapidly. So the Spring framework, Josh will go through a lot more, but greatly simplifies kind of the Java development experience. But more importantly, for a Force.com developer, how and when is it important and beneficial that you might be able to extend your Salesforce application to leverage some of the things running in Java, maybe custom libraries, maybe existing applications, maybe even existing developer resources that you might have available. Now, as I mentioned as well, we're not going to go into too much technical detail about the ins and outs of VMforce. We'll kind of have a bit of an overview on it, but we're definitely going to go much deeper in the next webinar, which is scheduled for September the 9th. So feel free to ask as many questions as you like. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. Anything that we don't get to, I'll certainly kind of post and blog on developer.force.com, and all the code that Josh is going to run through as well will also link through there. So at this point, the one thing that I've found when I've been speaking to a lot of developers after the VMforce announcement is that kind of million-dollar question, but we're Force.com developers. How can we take advantage of VMforce and Spring? Why is it important for us to understand what Spring offers? Since we are Force.com developers, we understand the power of it. So this is really where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. And importantly, in order to do that, I just wanted to give you that high-level overview if you haven't seen some of the introductory material on VMforce before, but just highlight a few areas where you might want to start thinking about how maybe you can extend your Salesforce apps to take advantage of Spring and the VMforce cloud. So at that stage, the area that I want to talk about is, at a high level, how VMforce itself works. So what you'll see here is I kind of skip through the build on this slide, but if you're an existing Java developer, you've typically deployed your Java web application into some type of servlet engine. It might be Tomcat or something similar to that, which is basically a web container where your application can run. In enterprise Java, that might have been an application server, so those kind of big heavyweight servers that take care of a lot of the plumbing for you, transaction management, so on and so forth. Within VMforce, we've multi-tenantized that JVM or the Java Virtual Machine Cloud so you can run your individual applications in their own sort of multi-tenant environment in the cloud. But now how Force.com developers and Java applications can certainly take care of it is via this connectivity that we'll go through in a bit more called JPA, which is the Java Persistence Architecture. So that allows you, as an example, if you're a Spring developer, to call into Force.com and access the Force.com database to get abilities that are inherent in the platform, searching, reporting, mobile, all those sort of abilities that you have there, but that communication is bidirectional. So if you're a Force.com developer with an application, a Spring application developed in VMforce and deployed in that cloud, you now will have the ability to reach out from Force.com, again via the JPA, and take advantages of that existing web app. So that might be libraries, resources, anything that's inside that kind of VMforce JVM cloud, you can now take advantage of it. So I wanted to give you two quick examples on maybe how you might be able to do this, just to start you thinking about it when Josh goes through a lot of the introduction to Spring. So one of the big areas that we find a lot that's very compelling is integration. So take, for example, you might be an enterprise customer and you have an existing application like an IBM or a TIBCO or anything that might be one of those kind of integration buses that are out there. Very typically, large organizations have existing applications and very often Java applications that have the ability and the knowledge to connect to those on-premise applications. You don't necessarily want to rewrite all of that logic. With VMforce, you might deploy that Java app into the cloud and use Force.com and the ability via JPA to reach out and connect to those Java apps to get your logic and get your information. But important as well is the ability to delegate some of that work maybe to existing Java people. I'm always a big advocate that technology is about enabling people. So if you have an organization of skilled Java developers, why not take advantage of them? SpringSource being kind of the de facto framework that's out there, and there's a lot of skilled Java developers out there, you want to take advantage of those abilities and leverage those resources as best you can, especially in this difficult environment in the economy. So another example is a data processing scenario. So let's say, again, you might have an existing app that has some kind of heavyweight processing, foreign exchange, currency, stock trading, things like those. You want to be able to leverage a lot of that existing assets and maybe even libraries that have been developed over time, over, say, the 10 years of Java's experience and life that you might be able to take advantage of by calling out from Force.com into a VMforce app. So there's another example of kind of going out from Force.com to VMforce, but there's also a lot of abilities that you might decide that, okay, we've got skilled Java developers, let's build something on the Spring framework and let's deploy it into the cloud and take advantage of the Force.com database and searching and reporting as we'd mentioned before. So I wanted to give you that quick overview just so you can kind of put in your mind some of the ways that you might be able to take advantage of Spring and VMforce as a technology. And at that stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it over to Josh for the hands-on and demonstration stuff. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Quentin. Good morning, everybody. My name is Josh Long. I'm the SpringSource developer advocate. My job is to better illuminate some of these possible integrations with the Spring platform, and in particular, compelling solutions around this VMforce cloud and how you guys can use it to better build systems and architectures. I've written a book or two on the topic on Spring itself, and I'm generally out there, so I hope you'll find what I talk about today useful. Let's talk a little bit about SpringSource to frame the discussion. Let's talk about where the Spring platform came from and what the company is and so on. SpringSource itself was originally the byproduct of a book that was published in 2003 by Rod Johnson and Jürgen Haller in which they outlined a framework, a better framework, a framework that was so compelling and so useful that people started coalescing around it and building up new solutions. And that originally was christened the Spring framework. That framework experienced widespread adoption, and people started using it in droves, and that eventually became sort of the de facto standard. There are now multi-millions, and in fact, there are more Java people using Spring than anything else, likely. Eventually, the company SpringSource was acquired by VMware last year in 2009, and with an eye towards the cloud and towards the future, VMware and Salesforce have come together, and we're working on better enabling people to build apps on the cloud with Spring as that sort of glue layer underneath, right? It's the one that lets you slide into the cloud seamlessly without sacrificing sales that you've worked hard for, Let's take a little look at what the Spring framework is in an abstract sense. Generally, the Spring framework is a lot of simplifying APIs on top of existing APIs that have been around since time immemorial, or in this case, 1999. We've got very basic RPC mechanisms, messaging mechanisms, data access, web processing mechanisms in the core Java EE stack. And for a long time, the Spring framework was more about simplifying and enabling people to use those APIs in a compelling way.
So Josh, this is a really important slide. For anybody that's done Java development in the past, myself included, there was so much complexity in Java, especially when you look at enterprise Java beans, that people found it really difficult to especially do persistence and transactions and things like that. So what you're saying is Spring is really focusing on simplifying all of that.
Absolutely, and it does this. It's taken away the pain and drudgery of those tasks and mitigated them to the simplest bare minimum APIs that you need in Java code, and then extracts the bits that are sort of salient and only worthy of doing once into configuration, right?
And this is certainly compelling to Force.com developers who are used to that simplicity. You can do just about anything, and you can do it relatively simple.
Absolutely, and this is why this is a compelling alternative for Force.com developers, is because this will feel right at home in a lot of ways. In addition to the simplifying APIs, the Spring framework has sort of ventured out into sort of API verticals, if you will, centered on a lot of different things, including, as we just talked about, application integration and batch processing. So there's a lot of compelling use cases centered around using the Spring framework to solve integration problems and to solve batch loading and to solve lots of other use cases, which I didn't have enough room on the screen, and I don't think anybody would, to solve. We should take a look at the lay of the land here. It's important to note that these frameworks are all sort of built on top of the core Spring framework. The most compelling value of the core Spring framework is that it's one thing. It's all the same kind of stuff. So everything you use inside the Spring platform builds upon the core Spring framework, and that's key to its value, right? It's just plain old Java objects, very simple code that's unit testable. It doesn't have any sort of magic that has to happen inside of a container, instead of like a server, for example. You don't have to deploy it there. You can do unit tests. You can write code locally. You can, it just feels like what you would write normally in Java code. And the fact that it works consistently all throughout the platform is very, very compelling, right? So it lets you learn one metaphor, one idiom, and then suddenly your skills translate into applicable APIs. Let's talk about some of those APIs here. I've got a lot of, frameworks listed on this table here, and I won't presume to cover them all, but Spring Security, for example, is one that's very popular in the community. It's one that cross-cuts a whole bunch of different concerns, including web applications and enterprise applications, and it allows you to do authentication and roles and realms and all that, all from a very standard context inside of the Spring framework.
So Josh, in your experience out in the community, is there something that's more popular than others? So Spring Webflow, for instance, there's a lot of web apps already built on Spring. So I would suspect that especially enterprise customers that have Java applications deployed, there might be a lot of like Spring web apps as an example. Is there anything else that might stand out?
Sure. So clearly some of these frameworks are more popular than others. As I mentioned, the core Spring framework is what underlies all of them. But included in the core Spring framework is the Spring MVC framework, right? And that's the web stack. That stack is actually what we'll talk about today. And it's on that stack that Spring Webflow and that Groovy on Grails and that Spring Roo and these other sort of productivity solution stacks are built, right? So it's all leveraging Spring MVC. So that's ever present. It's omnipresent. Spring Webflow is a more specific sort of, you've got a use case that involves wizards or sort of a stateful progression through a form on a website, and that's the use case you'd address with Spring Webflow. Obviously, you're not going to build, well, you probably could, but you wouldn't want to build the next, bazillion page application with Spring Webflow because it has state, right?
So I'm one of these people that like to see versus talk. So let's have a look at some demos and some code. I know it's early for us here, but especially the guys in India are probably ready and ready to go.
Well, sure. So bear in mind that as we go down the list here, we have Spring Batch, which is a very compelling solution for people who look to do batch sort of data loading solutions. Spring Integration is a very compelling solution for a lot of people who would otherwise use TIBCO or things like that. We have Spring AMQP, which is our API that ties into AMQP-based message brokers, including the market-leading RabbitMQ. These are all sort of, once you understand Spring, all these become applicable and useful. So let's review some of the core virtues, right? We've got the unified component model. We've talked about that. That's important. Once you understand how to write simple objects and how to prescribe their lifecycle and hook all into those lifecycle events in the container, then everything else becomes natural. Spring provides, this is perhaps its most famous virtue, is it provides inversion of control or dependency injection. The idea is that you want to avoid coding logic related to acquiring and initializing resources in your code. You'd rather express that you have a dependency and then let the actual acquisition of that dependency lay in logic in another tier, right, and some sort of configuration tier. Another very powerful thing you can do with the Spring Framework is aspect-oriented programming. Aspect-oriented programming lets you describe cross-cutting concerns across your stack, concerns that are perhaps not naturally slid in underneath your framework in your application in terms of a base class, things that you want to be able to apply uniformly, but you can't.
So this is one of the tenets that we'll see as we go through, especially this webinar, because being Force.com developers, there's going to be a lot of new terminology that you might hear, aspect-oriented programming, dependency injection, things like that. And what we've tried to do, you'll see, especially through the demos and the recaps, we're going to do kind of draw an analogy between something that you know in Force.com to what we've spoken about in Spring. It's not necessarily to say that they are the same. It's to help you kind of guide yourself in the learning and understand which tool is right for the job and when.
Absolutely. Aspect-oriented programming is one of those things that brings a lot of people to the core Spring Framework. It's very powerful. And you might imagine the use case of somebody wanting to add logic for logging or auditing on method invocations uniformly across a whole service layer. The other thing that's very powerful about the Spring Framework is that it's best practices oriented, right? Code that you write is sort of it's going to be slightly more opinionated. It's going to benefit from the wisdom of a lot of smart people. You're building on the shoulders of giants in the truest way. It'll be easier to build scalable N-tier architectures, right?
So we're all code monkeys here. Let's see some code.
Absolutely. Here we go. We're on this. This is the first demo. We'll go through it and actually drop down to the bare metal here. What we're trying to do in our example, our hypothetical, is we're going to build a simple application, a simple library, right, if you will. This is the SpringSource tool suite right here. This is an IDE that SpringSource provides. It offers the most compelling solution for Spring development. It's built on top of Eclipse with a lot of the sort of bugs fixed and add a lot of polish and a lot of utilities added. So it's easily my favorite IDE, and I think you'll find it to be the same for you. What we want to do is we wanted to build a little utility library, something that provides a service that we can use in another application as a provider. If you launch the SpringSource tool suite, which like I said is free and you can download it from the website, you typically start up with a file menu, go to New, go to Spring Template Project, and you'll choose Simple Spring Utility Project. That'll provide most of the code that we're gonna explore here, and then you can just fill in the lines and add your custom logic. The project that's created is a Maven project, and Maven is sort of the build system that a lot of the stuff we do is built on Maven. Maven takes care of handling the builds and acquiring dependencies for acquiring libraries that you need in your application. It makes it so that you don't have to do anything besides specify them and they just appear. So here's a fictitious example. We want to build a service that lets you retrieve customer records from a data store, right? You would typically start off describing that dependency in terms of a customer service interface. This is the contract that we want to publish to consumers of our service, right? We don't want them to know that we have a specific implementation. We just want them to know that if they call get customer by ID and pass in an ID of type along, they're going to get a customer record back, whatever that means. And this is a natural way to start. There's no special Spring foo to this or anything. Customer itself, the record for customer, is just a plain old POJO. Absolutely, uninteresting in every way. It's, in fact, but for these first two lines, the private long ID and the private string first name and last name, the rest of this is just boilerplate code that SpringSource Tool Suite will take care of generating for you. We use that to hold the data from the data store. So now let's look at our implementation, right? Actually, let's look at our client first. Let's look at the two different cases with how we might write this client. We know that we have an implementation, and this implementation is this one right here. It's customer service imp, and it implements customer service. Its job is going to be to implement the interface and provide an actual implementation of the contract. So here we're simply iterating over a collection of customers, and we're predicating the returned value. We're sifting through the customers, and we're returning the customer whose ID matches the passed-in parameter. You'll note that we don't have there's no logic in here for the actual, where does the collection get filled, right? Surely this is, something has to take care of this, right? In our case, we've expressed that we need this dependency and that we need a collection of data, a collection of customers. We've left that configuration to a higher level, right? It's the job of the client to set that up. Your typical example will depend on your typical example will have code that's initialized inline at the source site, and this is this example right here, right? This is an example where you're instantiating the customer service implementation, and you've passed in the customers, and you've actually set up customer records, and you're using it. And what you've done is you've hard-coded knowledge about the implementation for the clients, and that's a dangerous way to run a railroad, right? You want to be able to hide the fact that this implementation is what's being passed to the client. You want to be able to hide that logic.
I think it's dangerous because I'm customer number 2 there. Why aren't I customer number 1?
Well, you're customer number 1 in my book, buddy. So let's look at the revised version. Now we're going to ask the Spring container. In this case, the central piece for the Spring container is the application context object. It holds the knowledge about the creation, instantiation, and lifecycle of these objects, and we can ask it for references to different services. That knowledge, that configuration is set up in XML. So here we've actually gone to the application context, which is configured by this XML file, and we've asked it for a bean implementing this interface. And that's what we get. It'll provide us the implementation that we've configured. And the customer, the client in the site, in this case, has absolutely no local knowledge of the implementation specifics, right?
So this is an example of what you mentioned before, dependency injection. So we're taking out the logic, in this instance, the logic of data.
Right.
Sort of Quentin Wall, Josh Long as the customers, taking it out of the code. So that certainly makes things more maintainable going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's actually look at that so you can see where we've moved that out into the Spring container, and it's exactly as you might expect it, right? Here we've instantiated a bean customer service imp, and we've created a property for customers, and we've passed in two different types of beans, one customer and another customer. And that logic is hidden there, and we don't have to care about how it got there. We just know that when we get it, it'll be correctly set up for us, right?
And obviously this is a super simple example.
Sure.
Going forward, we're going to look at how you can leverage kind of the Spring's data access APIs, for instance, to go to force.com database to get your data.
Right. This is a great example of dependency injection. Clearly, it's nonsensical and trivial. So
that was a kind of a super simple introduction to Spring. You'll notice that the language, first time you've used Java, is very syntactically similar to Apex. One of the other things that you should be used to is developing in Eclipse. So force.com developers used to the force.com IDE. The STS is the equivalent of that, so you should certainly feel at home on there. So what we're trying to show is that the learning curve very often isn't super steep, especially when you look at Spring's kind of tenet of simplifying Java development. We also kind of spoke about POJOs, plain old Java objects. You can kind of think of those as analogous to standard and custom objects without the DML, and we'll go through some of the data manipulation soon. But take this first demo as kind of like those foundation learning building blocks, so you know what you can do with Spring. But I'm one of these people that always want to know more. So, Josh, I think one of the big areas is how can, say, Spring, for instance, leverage the power of the Force.com database?
Absolutely.
Glad you asked.
So the data access APIs in the Spring framework are formidable. There is support for accessing data in every conceivable way, including at the lowest level using JDBC. And even there, the Spring support is very compelling and simple, but it's not the best way to go. There is support for open source alternatives like Hibernate and things like that. But again, what we want is something that's both simple and that Spring can provide for you in a simple way, and that is standard. And so that's JPA. That's the prevailing solution for describing the mapping of records in a database or data store, in this case the Force.com APIs, to objects, right? When you use JPA, you're hidden from the complexities and the nuances of mapping a record into an object. It just works. So you can provide in different drivers, and that those drivers specify how JPA connects to a data store. In this case, the recommended way, of course, is to use the JPA implementation provided by VMforce.com to connect to Force.com's data records, the custom objects.
I've done a lot of Java development in the past and data access, and I've used JDBC, and it's nasty and messy, and then I've gone to Force.com, and I don't really have to worry about that data connectivity. So one of the first things I saw with VMforce and connecting Force.com database was like, do I have to go back to some of that difficulty that I did in JDBC? JPA certainly kind of standardizes some of that approach, but the really nice thing, and we'll see it in a minute, is how simple the JPA adapters are and the templates are inside Spring. This was one of the really compelling values that I could see to make this kind of VMforce thing real and live and get people to the cloud quickly.
Absolutely. The JPA implementation provides bidirectional support, so you can actually define your JPA. You can define your custom objects in Salesforce, and those objects you can actually access those as Java objects on the client, or you can define your Java objects and then those get created as custom objects on the server. So It's clean, it's natural, it maps well, it's object-oriented when you need it to be, and it's scalable because it's built on top of the VMforce cloud.
So if people on the call take one thing away from this webinar, certainly start having a look at JPA to get you guys familiar if you want to set yourself up for success for VMforce.
Absolutely. In this webinar, we're going to build upon the existing contract that we specified, and we're going to talk to a local database, which is not admittedly the VMforce data stores, just to sort of drive home the point and drive home the idea. But that difference, the nuances that are involved in setting up a Salesforce connectivity versus talking to a local data store is isolated in one little place, right? And you don't have to. Once you've changed that, you're up and running, and you're off to the races. So let's go back to our example, revisit it a little bit, and this time we'll see about upgrading it to talk to JPA.
So this is my favorite demo of the session.
Absolutely, mine too. So again, I'm not going to rehash too much here. We have the same basic setup as before. In fact, exactly the same. We have the customer service contract, right? And we haven't changed anything there to reflect the fact that we're talking to a database. Nothing is different. Nothing is new. All we've done, and indeed the client, by the way, is the same. All we're doing is getting a customer by ID, and we don't care how it works in the background. All we've changed is the implementation, and that indirection is possible because Spring isolates you from it, right? So the customer service implementation here is ridiculously simple. It's even simpler than the one before, and the one before wasn't even talking to a database. We've injected a reference to the JPA template object, which is sort of a centerpiece that you'll deal with when using JPA from Spring, and we've asked it to find a record of type customer by ID, right? The knowledge that JPA has about customer is encoded in the annotations on our simple little object that we had before. So we've added that, and we've told it that it specifies an ID using these annotations. And we've told it that the last name and the first name are columns, and that's all it needs to understand to talk to the database for us, right? So let's look at the actual Spring configuration itself. It's a little bit different, but this is where the magic happens, right? This is where we set up the JPA implementation and the connectivity. Here we've defined a data source. The data source is connecting locally to a little database I'm running locally. Again, this is something you would have connect to Salesforce itself, and that's easy to do. And we've defined that we want to create our customer service database implementation, and that we want to pass it a reference to the JPA template. The JPA template itself is defined up here, right? It's just a little utility object that you can create, and then it's thread safe. It in turn gets a reference to our entity manager factory, which is the sort of the one single shared object in JPA that gives out sessions and hands out handles to the service itself for all people that want to use it, all services that want to use it. And that's it. We've defined this object and we set up all this stuff in here, but all the code had to know about was that I was going to get a fully configured JPA template ready to rock and roll with, right? And
I'm pretty simple, but I think that's awesome. So certainly what we're going to see a lot more in the next webinar, like any good demo, we're leaving some good stuff as well, is that VMforce is going to provide that JPA adapter. So as an example, what we just configured then could connect to the Force.com database. So I think that maybe it's too early in the morning here still, but I think that's awesome. So.
Oh, I think so too. And the use case when connecting to the Force.com database is absolutely amazing. So let's go back to our slides here.
So another super quick demo there, and I just want to kind of relate it back to Force.com terms for everybody that's on the line, especially when we kind of talk about JDBC or database connectivity. It's one of those things that the platform does amazingly well. That whole database connectivity is hidden from you, and if you're looking at how you can leverage Spring, you don't want to go into the weeds again. That's kind of one of the reasons why you like the Force.com database. So we saw the JPA adapter there. It's very, very configuration-based, so you should be very comfortable with creating and configuring it there. But as I mentioned before, the big thing, the key takeaway here is if you want to start to set yourself up for success for developing in VMforce, certainly spend some time and have a look at JPA, and in particular the JPA implementation in Spring is by far the best that I've seen.
Absolutely. So we've built this customer service library, right? And we've provided this the ability to talk to a service and get a record back. Let's talk about kicking it up a notch, right? Now we want to consume that library. We want to actually put it to work somewhere. The next logical step for a lot of people is to build a web application. And, of course, Spring support there is first in flight, right? Spring works on top of the Servlet API, which is part of the standard. That it's one of the standards out there, but it's very low level. Servlets are very low level, and you don't want to write code directly in that. Servlets are basically it's what you configure and you put into a container to handle request response scenarios in a web container. A lot of Servlet containers like Tomcat, or of course Spring Source's TC Server, which is a powerful, management-friendly, scalable Tomcat derivative that has a lot of extra value adds for administration and monitoring. Using those servers, you want to connect to Spring, so you do that by installing the Spring MVC framework, right? It is just a servlet.
So the MVC is something that Force.com developers should be comfortable with. Visualforce, Apex, the controller model still uses that kind of model view controller.
Absolutely. This diagram here will seem very natural to people who are coming from Force.com. In it, we describe the front controller, which is just the dispatcher servlet. It's this one servlet that you have to connect, and then the rest of the ride is all about using Spring and the idioms that you know and love. So you configure the dispatcher servlet, requests come into the web container, hit the dispatcher servlet, and then are forwarded to individual controller beans, right? Controllers are configured in Spring. Their job is to handle the business logic and to do processing based on requests and to delegate to the view layer, right? Presumably, they'll fill out some sort of context packet with any kind of data that's relevant to the rendering of the view, and then it'll forward that data onto the view layer itself. So here you can see that we've got a view template, right? And that'll feel very natural to people who are coming from Force.com, and it's the way it works in Spring as well, so nothing new there. All right, so now let's go to a simple web application. We'll cut through. Again, this is another case where there's a lot of code that you sort of have to just take for granted. If you're using the Spring Source tool suite, it is absolutely trivial to get it bootstrapped and to avoid having to sling through the gunk. Go to the file menu and go to New, and then go to Template Project, and then there you can choose Spring MVC Project, and that'll bootstrap most of this. That'll take care of most of the configuration. All we're interested in doing now is providing one of those controllers that we talked about, right? So we've configured a simple controller here, and at this point we've moved all the logic into annotations, right? So there's not really, Spring is looking at this object, this controller, and it's seeing that annotation, and it's understanding that requests for the endpoint at /welcome should be handled by this bean, and in particular, it should forward all GET requests to this method, right? This method should be invoked whenever there's a GET request on this URL. You can see that we've annotated the parameter into the method. We said we have a parameter of type long customer ID, and we've described it as a request parameter. The request parameter it's exactly what you think it is. It's what you put after the question mark in the GET URL in the browser, right? So it'll come into this method, and it'll get called in a type-safe way. And then here's our customer service. We've acquired a reference to it, just as we did before, and we just have it auto-wired. Spring will take care of injecting it for us. We don't have to explain to this controller how to get a hold of it or how to instantiate it. It's all taken care of by the container. And then we're free to use it to get customers by ID, in this case the request parameter, and then put that customer record inside of a map here, context, and then we forward that map by returning it to the view template, right? Once it's in the view template, once it gets forwarded to the view template, it'll render out, and this is another place where it'll just seem absolutely familiar for people who are coming from the Force.com platform. It's just a simple view template, right? This is nonsensically trivial. We've got some expressions that are enumerating the ID and the first name and the last name.
So this again should look very, very similar to Visualforce. So we have the notion of controllers, which could be a standard controller or maybe an Apex kind of custom controller. But now we're looking at, in this instance, it's kind of JSP type syntax, but again, very similar to kind of the tags and annotations that are in Visualforce. So very, very short, easy learning curve here too.
Right. Let's look at this example in action, right? As I've discussed, this whole thing is based on, it's talking to a database. Here's that database. Let me run a select all from customer. This is, by the way, I'm using sort of a low-level database here. This is more work than you should have to do, but you can see that I can select all from customer and I get these records, and that's what we're talking to from the customer service object. Here's our view. Here's that web application I was talking to you about. You can see that in the endpoint there we've got welcome, and then question mark, and then ID, and then one, and then one or two, for example. And you can see that it brings up the data from the database live. And that's all because of the logic that you just saw there.
So another super great demo. We're kind of coming up close to the end of our time, so I'm going to kind of go past the recap pretty quickly. But one thing that you'll notice is that MVC and the pattern is very, very similar to what you're used to in Force.com, and Spring certainly takes advantage of that as well. So it's not a new paradigm that you need to learn. It's one of those examples where you now have some new tools in your toolbox, and you need to kind of look and understand where you can leverage and take the most advantage of it. So at that point, we're going to kind of start wrapping up with a quick summary, some kind of call to actions where you want to go next, and then after that, we'll get to some questions. So just before we get to there, it's one of those areas where we've spoken a lot about VMforce in its ability to kind of enable the Java developers to reach the cloud. But not only are we leveraging Spring to be able to make Java developers' life easier in that instance, we're allowing via VMforce, and in particular the JPA adapter that we spoke about a little bit here as well, is that it allows Java developers to leverage Force.com services, such as search, reporting, mobile, all those sort of things, but this relationship is kind of symbiotic. It's bidirectional. So Force.com developers can certainly leverage VMforce. So there's a lot of Spring apps out there already that have existing apps or logic or code, so on and so forth. There'll be libraries that are inside the Java world that perhaps Force.com developers will certainly want to take advantage of.
Finally, another takeaway is that because you're using Spring, you are able to benefit from existing skill sets. You're able to benefit from all these existing libraries, as he just mentioned, and you're able to benefit from the uniformity of the platform, right, as it applies to all these different technologies. Suddenly they're all open to you, and you can build on top of this and on top of the cloud.
I think for Force.com developers, some of them, what I've traditionally found is that some of them are coming from a .NET background, a Java background. Learning Java EE or Enterprise Edition is a big, steep learning curve. Spring greatly simplifies that.
Absolutely.
So at that point, I know we've kind of gone through things relatively quickly here, and there's a lot of things that you might want to learn more about, especially if you want to learn about Spring and JPA. Go and have a look at Spring Source. There's a bit.ly link there for a good tour through Spring. VMforce homepage has a lot of information there. More importantly, we have another VMforce webinar, which will be a bit more of a deeper dive onto VMforce. So I've seen a bunch of the questions that have been coming through. We're going to address a whole bunch of those in the next webinar. But there's also a series of live events coming up. The second half of the year is always pretty active for live events. Dreamforce is obviously coming up in the start of November. Spring 1 is coming up. When is it, Josh? October? September?
September, yeah.
Yep, September in Chicago. So we're all going to be there, and we're going to be talking a lot more about VMforce there as well. So anybody that's going to Spring 1, you'll certainly see us there as well. And again, obviously, Dreamforce, there's going to be a lot of big news and big announcements out there as well. And what I'm looking forward to is Stevie Wonder, obviously, playing on some of the night events as well. So at that stage, I want to finish it up. And thanks, Josh, for joining us, especially getting up so early. The sun's finally starting to rise. We
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate your feedback, though. So there's a link there. If you could just spend a few minutes to fill out the online survey, that certainly helps us know how we did and how we can improve. And we appreciate you guys standing with us. And at this stage, we're going to spend about 10 minutes and go through some of the questions.
By the way, that might be in October. Go ahead and just visit the link and buy your tickets for Spring 1.
So I'll certainly know when I book my airfare and flights, and then I'll be there, I promise. It's still certainly early. So I'll take some of the questions because most of them look VMforce related, Josh, but you feel free to jump in on any as well. But will the webinar and recording and code be made available post-webinar? Definitely yes. So I'll be blogging about it and trying to answer a bunch of questions. Josh, you've already provided the code to me, so it's up to me to wake up and get a little bit more coffee and post that information. So let's have a look. Can Java apps use Force.com as well instead of Force.com using Java? Most definitely. We kind of covered that in the summary slide a little bit. So Java apps, obviously what we're talking about here is they can take advantage of the Spring framework. That certainly makes things easier. But to take advantage of, especially via the JPA adapter that we spoke about here, they can take advantage of the Force.com databases and services that you're familiar with in the platform. Search, reporting, security, all that sort of thing. It's there inherently for you.
And there are more integrations being added all the time, right? Different use cases that are being handled from the Java and Spring side. Yep, better enable this stuff.
Exactly, and I see a lot of use for. We spoke a bunch at our local meetup event last night about integration and things like that. I think that's going to be a really powerful one there as well. So,
batch processing.
Yep. So will you be able to write Apex on the STS? And I'm assuming the question is, can I develop Apex in STS? So we were just having this discussion this morning, I think, which is pretty scary for a 4 o'clock. But STS is an Eclipse-based IDE in essence.
Right.
Force.com IDE is also a plug-in to there. The one thing Josh and I weren't sure, and I'll certainly get back and answer it, is whether you can install the IDE, the Force.com IDE on top of STS. That's sadly enough a to-do for me today, so I'll certainly post and put the answer in. We all kind of want to make sure we know the answer to that one.
I'll be eager to find out.
Yep. So this was a good question that I found, that if I'm a Java developer, why, when would I ever use Apex to implement business logic? seems like VMforce replaces the need for Apex. This came up a lot during the announcement time, and there's some good blog material on developer.force that Anshu goes through a lot of details on there in terms of some of the differences. But Apex certainly isn't going anywhere and is tightly integrated into the platform. Just a quick example, I would certainly still write triggers on the platform in Apex because Apex understands and is kind of tied into that life cycle of records. So very often that's where I am writing my business logic, so I'll put that in there. But if I have an existing Java app that has business logic, I don't necessarily want to or have to rewrite that, but I want to deploy it into the cloud to take advantages of the cloud.
Right.
Let's have a look. What else do we have here? Is this relevant to Apex developers or just for Java developers? So, interesting question.
Yeah.
At the start, what we mentioned was that this is really to try and help Apex developers understand a new tool that they might have in their arsenal to build and develop things. Java developers also want to see Force.com database, but as an Apex developer, I want the ability, and we'll see a lot more in this in the upcoming months and webinars, I want the ability to call out from Force.com to existing logic and services that might be written in Spring, as an example.
Yeah.
So I certainly want the ability to do that. So definitely relevant to Apex developers.
Right. And by the way, it's envisioned that as much as you might build your logic in Apex and you might build it independently in Spring and Java, there's lots of room for great collaborative uses, right? You can actually call out from Apex into Spring apps. So, for example, you might have the events of some sort of back office application being driven by triggers and web services calls being made from Apex. That's also very natural, and it's very, very quick because inside of Apex it's co-located and you get the benefits of being close to the data. And then when you need to integrate or you need some sort of web application to sync up with that or have communication channel, that's a great way to go.
So here's a great question. Will Force.com database access be as performant as a local database, or should we expect SOAP web service API level performance? It's one of those things that a lot of people don't realize, that more API transactions go through the platform than, say, through the browser. So the performance, especially with some of the latest enhancements like batch and bulk processing and all those sort of things, and some new things that we'll talk about at VMforce, performance has never really been an issue in terms of integration, especially kind of high-level kind of batch processing these days. So I don't think that will be an issue at all, especially kind of with the underlying plumbing and the JPA done. So you also have to remember that you're deploying your application, your Spring app, into the cloud, and guess where the Force.com database is? Into the cloud as well.
Mm-hmm. And your application, where it's not already able to take advantage of this really, really fast Salesforce APIs and these services, because it's in the cloud, it gets speed sauce as well, right? It gets to scale out with ease.
Speed sauce sounds good right now. So.
Oh yeah.
So we're coming up to time. I just want to kind of finish up with one question. Where can we get the connector for Force.com? And I'm assuming that means the JPA connector. The intent is that will certainly be provided with VMforce for you, so you can kind of get up and running.
Yeah, and I imagine it'll be available as part of the Maven, as a Maven dependency you can access as well.
Okay, so let's see if we have we'll try and take one more question here.
Yeah, I like this one.
Sure, go for it.
The question is, can VMforce use some other open source Java framework, for example, and then it names a web framework? And the answer is absolutely. Yes, that's the beautiful thing about this, is that you're suddenly, the whole world of Java integrations and libraries and capabilities and frameworks becomes open to you. And in particular, we're optimized, of course, for applications using Spring. So yeah, it opens up the world for you. This is a brand new uncharted territory. You can access anything and talk to these services.
Okay, nice. So here's another one that's pretty interesting. Can we call Salesforce.com web services API from outside Force.com? It's not necessarily too relevant to the VMforce discussions, but you can always call the Salesforce APIs from just about anywhere. You go to developer.force.com and you can access a Java toolkit, a .NET, PHP, all those sort of things. So you can access it from just about anywhere these days, and there's certainly some more announcements that will make that even easier coming up as well. Josh, you had something to add on that one?
I did. This is another case where, without already from right now, we've already got a very compelling integration. You can already use Spring Web Services to talk to indeed any web service, but in specific, users of the Spring framework will be able to talk to the web services that are exposed from Salesforce, and it's very natural for Spring users. In fact, I would say the Spring Web Services framework is the easiest way to talk to SOAP, out there for any Java developer.
So one question that's been asked a couple of times in a few different ways is, what are the governor limits or the API limits that JPA calls may be subject to? So this is one of the areas that's still kind of being defined and organized, but it's also one of those areas that, in my experience, API calls and limits and governor limits are there for your benefit. When you look at how you develop and implement your code, especially with batch processing as an example, it intends on how intelligently and how smart you write your code, and you should never really hit those kind of governor and API limits. And I think JPA implementation will be the same way. We're developing in the cloud, you're developing in a multi-tenant environment. So it is a little bit different to developing locally, and you do have to think about how you are a good citizen, and I suspect that will be exactly the same in kind of a JPA world as well.
Absolutely. And I don't know what the actual limit is, but for example, there's a number that's given for the a magic number for the JPA batch processing. How many records can you change in a transaction? And there's a governed limit there, but if I recall, it was something very reasonable, something you would never ever, it was more than generous, and it'll work just fine if you're using Spring Batch to do batch processing. It'll be very intelligent, and you can scale no problem.
Yep. And I think that's the difference with any language. As long as you design something intelligently, some of these limits are certainly to help you stay in the green and stay good and positive code versus kind of, I remember writing in C and having to do pointers and memory allocation and things like that. Now that was difficult. So
that was you teaching the compiler.
Exactly. So I think at that time we're pretty well up for time, so I appreciate everybody attending. We'll get to some more questions in blogs. We'll post the code for you as well, and if there's still more that you're interested in, we have a replay of this session that we'll be doing again about at 10 a.m. Pacific. But apart from that, don't forget to fill out the survey. You still have the link on your screen right now, and that certainly helps us sort of know how to tailor going forward. And this is Quinton Wall and Josh Long, so thanks everybody for joining us this morning.